Teachers are already being coached over the summer during the COVID virus amidst the riots. Your teachers are already being coached about how specifically to talk about the riots when school starts again in the fall. Hint, don't be surprised if your kids come home from school, scream at you for your white privilege, and demand that you kneel while they burn down your house in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and this is The Dr. Duke Show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Dr. Duke Show, the only program that keeps you educated on the craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. Today, we start with new step-by-step instructions for teachers, more like dictums, that advise, more like order, how to talk to children about Black Lives Matter riots in their classrooms this fall. And yep, here we are now. And it's really pretty staggering that already they can't be bothered to teach these teachers how to teach math better, how to teach English better, literacy. No. They're very concerned that every teacher in America, and this is the dangers of federalizing education through things like Common Core, right? Every teacher now will have one way of explaining this, and it is completely extreme and over the top.
Of course it is. And I had already seen almost immediately, it was because the main riots were happening, started on a weekend. So that Monday or Tuesday, I had already seen how these teachers are being coaxed for the statewide social studies organization saying, when your kids get back, how to talk to them about the riots or the protests.
How you will
talk to them. Well, Education Week said that leaders of K-12 schools, colleges, and universities sometimes release formal statements when acts of racial violence and injustice occurred locally and elsewhere in our country. Many are writing now to their communities about the death of George Floyd, our black man in Minneapolis. And then they go on to talk about the point by point. Here are 6 things we suggest leaders who seriously aim to make a difference do.
Let's take them by one.
Yes.
We'll alternate. The first one is you must make those kids acknowledge that citizens across the country, citizens across the country are protesting not only the death of George Floyd, but also police killings of many other unarmed Black people over time. So in other words, don't let them think this is a one-off, right? It's justified because there's a history here.
Yeah, and if you want to talk about statistics, didn't they come out with statistics from last year? 15 Black men died at the hands of police officers, which statistically is not high. It is still a tragedy in every case. But if you want to look statistically, 15 is not a lot.
At least 15 African Americans have died in the riots.
For
an entire year, 700,000 cops, 15 dead African Americans. That's 15 too many.
Yes, fair.
But 15 have been killed in the riots. Where does Black Lives Matter stand on that?
Only wherever they feel like
by the
standing.
way, almost none of them were killed by cops.
Of course.
So where is Black Lives Matter? There's a group in Congress, a group of conservative Blacks who are now beginning a new movement called All Black Lives Matter, African Americans. And that I want to join that group because the ones killed by rioters, they count just as much. All those Black aborted babies, they matter too.
Oh, yes,
Blacks killing Blacks in record numbers in Chicago,
Yep.
18 in one day, they matter too, even though Black Lives Matter and Spike Lee and Clyburn in the Senate and kneeling Nancy in her African makeup, they can't be bothered to count them.
She's too busy putting her high heels on and stumbling. Number 2, say how you personally feel about police officers killing unarmed Black people. Also, say why you feel the way you do.
This is the dangers of social emotional learning. Notice how you cited statistics. I cited facts. Those things now will get you canceled. Pointing out
Delete.
Yep, they will get you canceled by pointing out the facts of this stuff. They don't want the facts. They want the raw emotion. And so they're literally teachers being trained to ignore the facts of what's going on and get little kids riled up. Maybe they'll burn down their nap time, the little block house in kindergarten. Maybe they'll burn it down for white privilege.
Feelings don't care about facts anymore. Sorry, Ben Shapiro, your facts over feelings? No, now it's feelings.
Well, that's it. We have reached the point, and we've seen this coming, where facts and science and reason and empirical knowledge, this is all white supremacy. What we need is good old-fashioned African Americans and white Antifa members succumbing to their feelings and destroying everything in sight. And we justify it. Now let's justify it to little kids in public schools. How about number 3? Use words that explicitly name racial violence. Do not soften the intensity of the systematic racism with broad language language about diversity and equity. Use terms like white supremacy, anti-blackness, racism. In other words, indoctrinate kids to the most radical position on this. Yep. Ignore nuance, ignore subtlety, ignore the youth and the innocence of your children. Hit them over the head with a great big BLM stick.
It makes me think BLT. But okay, BLM stick is correct because they say, as we've been learning, that if you do not march lockstep and key to exactly, and then now they're saying the words you use have to be precise to what they want, and any divergence from that, delete.
You get canceled. And it's amazing how many liberals are coming under fire now. How many liberals are losing their positions now? How many liberal people have said the wrong thing and have been canceled, right? And this is fascism, guys. And when you're using little kids to promote fascism, when you're telling teachers there's only one way and it's a radical way of talking about this stuff with your kids, that's quasi-fascism. It's here, it's now. Welcome to the real world.
All right, well, let's get to number 4. Call for readers of the statement to ask black students, black teachers, black staff members, and black families how they are affected by this, what support they need from their schools, and what they would like to have happen in this moment and beyond. So you're saying that you have to only look at black students, black teachers, black staff members. We're told that there are none of those anywhere in our schools, that we don't have enough diversity. Right. And I thought, though, that you could identify as whoever you want to be. So if you identify as a black student, a black teacher, a black staff member, does that count?
And suddenly singling black kids out in classes and singling black teachers out and forcing them into roles they didn't necessarily act for, now that's okay. Only the white people behind Black Lives Matter, only the white brain trust of anarchists behind pulling the strings of Black Lives Matter, only those white people could have come up with this.
All right, moving on. A so-called protester, which is not a protester at all, because if you vandalize something, that makes you a criminal.
No, don't you understand, according to the calculus of Black Lives Matter, violence is necessary to get the point across?
Silence is
violence and killing and rooting and arson. These are just peaceful protests, Katie.
I understand.
Yes,
I apologize.
I know.
Cancel me. Zachary Bornstein was arrested on felony charges for defacing a monument on the campus at the University of Mississippi. Don't worry, Zachary Bornstein is a geometry teacher for junior high students when he's not breaking the law. So Bornstein is also a graduate of the University of Mississippi. So let's just go back and vandalize where we got our education degree.
It's about time the vandalism takes place on the college campuses, only they're going after Confederate monuments. So by all means, if you can tear down a Confederate statue, can't you tear down the student union of the university that housed that Confederate monument? Why not? I mean, and so if they're going to do this, it should definitely take place on college campuses. It's stupid. It's counterculture. It's fascist. All of this need to eradicate history. But fine, if you're going to do it, let the universities feel the full weight of this. Burn it all down, right, if that's what you want to do. Arson, we've been told now, is peaceful protest.
Oh, yes, it is.
And let's not forget that how long it took universities to diversify. How long was it into the 20th century before African Americans were allowed in colleges? Why aren't you burning down chancellors' offices? I mean, come on, arson is a legitimate thing now. Come on, let's get on board with this. You think this is incendiary? Notice the pun. I'm just simply applying what college professors have theorized for these protesters, rioters, to colleges themselves. Seems like a fair trade-off. You incite the violence, you suffer the violence. How about that, universities?
Well, yes. Bornstein, though, he's all about the spiritual genocide. That's what he wrote on the monument. It was a Confederate monument on the campus. And now he's facing felony charges for injuring, destroying, or defacing certain cemetery property, public buildings, schools, or churches, or property thereof, which is a felony. Here's video of them actually trying to clean up the monument. And university staff were trying to power wash the graffiti off, and it's not successful. But hey, it doesn't matter because Chancellor Glenn Boyce said the monument's being moved anyway. This is a time for change. For me, that means moving the monument away from the center of our campus. That monument has divided the campus, and the process of its removal from the circle is one I am committed to seeing through to completion. There is more to do, but this
Go ahead, Chancellor. You remove everything from campus that divides anybody. You do that. Anything that offends any African American or Hispanic student, any atheist student, any transgender student, any female student, go ahead. Go ahead, Chancellor. Get rid of everything. Get rid of everything in the library that divides people who have this kind of radical politics, and just close up your shop right now. And I love the fact, as far as Bornstein is concerned, that isn't it interesting that progressives actually believe in spirituality when it comes to things like this?
Yes.
Spirituality for white people is a sham. It's a scam. Christianity is a fraud. It's cowardice. But that wonderful paternalistic white liberal position. But African American spiritual, they're so deep. They're so, I mean, it's so a part of who they are.
It's ingrained.
Blacks don't crack. All these positive stereotypes of African Americans. Look at just how they're absolutely republished, how they're underscored by the paternalistic white liberals who control all this stuff.
Yeah, so one more note on this, because it's just too funny. Of course, Bornstein got so much support from the community because they stand in solidarity. Ariel Hudson, who's a graduate of the University of Mississippi as well, actually started a GoFundMe page because Bornstein, his bail was set at $5,000, and they had easily $20,000, which will be donated to the Mississippi Bail Fund. And she says, I created the fund for Zach because I felt it was the right thing to do. I knew that Zach was possibly going to be facing felony charges since it's a registered national landmark. I know that could mean a possible expensive bail bond, and I wanted to be prepared to get him out.
I repeat, the local donut store in your community, the local Target, didn't do anything to exploit black people, but universities did. For all the way through the first part of the 20th century, blacks were not allowed in schools. Blacks were segregated at universities. Blacks were withheld from higher education. We hear from campuses all the time that they are sites of rape and violence against women. We hear all the time that universities are complicit in a culture that is discriminatory. It's why we have to keep hiring 8,000 diversity officers. Given that the local donut store and the local Target does not have blood on its hands, your universities do. Where are the arsonists? Where are the Molotov cocktails? Where are the violent protests? How about throwing bricks at professors on the quad? Because if you're going to do that in downtown Minneapolis to all those private businesses, many of them owned by black people, shouldn't you be doing it to universities too? Or is this more Black Lives Matter hypocrisy?
All right, moving on, but still staying with the same stupidity. Well, Andrews University in Michigan, Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion, what a title. The Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion, Michael Nixon, says that conservative America and white America are hell-bent on creating a narrative of oppression as they protest state and local governments nationwide in favor of reopening the U.S. economy amid the coronavirus pandemic. Now, we're at the point now where the coronavirus is gone, right? Because we have protests for Black Lives Matter, because that matters.
Well, social distancing is gone when it comes to protesting.
Oh, yes, right? yes.
And rioting, that's okay.
But back when we were deciding, various states were kind of starting to loosen up their regulations and their restrictions again. We're talking Michigan specific, so Gretchen Whitmer is...
Heil Whitmer.
Heil. And so he is talking about how at that time, it's all conservative America who's at fault for all this. That's
let's go back to this. So you have an African American who is a diversity officer on a college campus.
A vice president.
A vice president of diversity who owes his job to campus inequality, right? The reason he's there is because of campus inequality. All these diversity officers and all the black and Hispanic ones, they owe their positions to the fact that universities are so racist and discriminatory that you need a battery, an army of people. And so what he's basically saying is that I was hired here to correct the rampant racism on my campus. But it's white people, conservative white people.
Yes, conservative. Make sure
conservative white people, right, who are the ones that have to construct narratives of oppression to protect themselves.
They're hell-bent.
So again, let's take this guy at his word. If conservative white people are constructing narratives to make themselves seem like victims, okay, you know that they're not victims, as you would say. Victims are the people on your campus. That's why you were hired, right? You were hired to protect the victimized minorities on your school's campus. So where are the protests? Why are you not calling for the destruction of your own university? Why are you, Mr. Nixon, not inviting tens of thousands of protesters to loot, maraud, and pillage on your campus? Wouldn't that be the logical thing, given your ethos and your worldview, your own rhetoric? Wouldn't that be the logical thing to do? Or is logic one of those white supremacists? Logic and consistency, those are those white people things that we have to get rid of, along with all those nasty statues.
That is true. And now when you take all the statements he made on a podcast of affirmative interaction about these protests when we were trying to open the economy, and you take it and you think now what has happened with all these protests for Black Lives Matter and social distancing, who cares? It's really enlightening. He says, I just do not understand the desire in mostly white America, particularly conservative America, to create this narrative of oppression, bro. It's like they're hell-bent on it. They have to equalize themselves into this oppression narrative. And then he says, what I see is a lot of mostly conservative whites going out in these protests and saying, well, look, the odds appear to be in my favor. And so let's get back to this thing and let's get back to business as usual because, I got health care. And then he added, a lot of minorities are going to die.
You know what, Mr. Nixon? The problem is that you have romanticized victimhood in a country with this kind of opportunity, in a country with this kind of freedom and upward mobility, even for African Americans. For God's sake, we've had a black president. We have black representatives at every form of government. We've got black billionaires and millionaires. The opportunity is there. So the problem you have, sir, is that you have so glorified victimhood in a country where there's very little of it. Why wouldn't whites want to be victims? Because they see the perks that you get if you are. And I want to make this very clear, too. Make this very clear to whoever's listening and wants to deceptively edit this video. I'm not calling for violence on college campuses. I am simply saying, by the logic of university professors and theorists, shouldn't the violence directed, again, at inner city, mostly black businesses, the burning and down and looting of oftentimes minority businesses, wouldn't that be better served on college campuses which have a huge legacy of excluding blacks, a huge legacy of hiring all these diversity officers to address the horrible conditions for minorities on campus? Wouldn't burning down the quad, wouldn't torching the local university bookstore, wouldn't throwing bricks again at tenured professors on the quad, and better yet, administrators, right? Wouldn't it be better? I mean, wouldn't that be a more accurate protest based on who's the ones who have this guilty legacy? I would think so. But again, I'm sure he wouldn't want his nice office damaged by those pesky black rioters. Keep them in poor black neighborhoods. That strikes me as another one of those hypocritically mixed messages.
And now it's time for some real education. Nikolai Gogol, who was born in 1809 and died in 1852, was a Russian dramatist and short story writer born in the Ukraine. Although Gogol was considered a major writer in the school of Russian literary realism, later critics identify his writing as fundamentally romantic, with strains of surrealism and the grotesque. His most famous short story is The Overcoat, published in 1842, which deeply influenced such great writers as Dostoevsky and Nabokov. Speaking about the history of Russian literature, Dostoevsky remarked that we all come out from Gogol's Overcoat, and Nabokov called The Overcoat the greatest Russian short story ever written. I
would go one step further. I would call The Overcoat perhaps the greatest short story ever written by anybody. Gogol, of course, was a generation before the great Russian writers, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and them. He was a little bit earlier. His life span actually almost exactly conforms to that of Edgar Allan Poe in America, who was using grotesques. He's got a great short story, Gogol does, called The Nose, in which a nose jumps off an important person and makes the rounds of Petersburg higher society, and the nose gets into all sorts of exploits. It's a fascinating story. It's really brilliantly written, and I think The Overcoat is my favorite. And besides, not just Nabokov, people like Nabokov and Dostoevsky who were influenced by him. Think of Franz Kafka. You could not have had the Metamorphosis, right, where Gregor Samson wakes up as a bug, as a cockroach, if you had not had writers like Poe and especially Gogol. The Overcoat is a beautifully touching story about a completely forgotten man, a man of low class who's working a terribly routine bureaucratic job, who has no money, who has no social life, he's unattractive, he's a loner, he lives by himself, he's brokenhearted. Just Russian degradation, just a brokenhearted, weak, small little man. And everybody around him in this freezing Russian winters, they all have these beautiful coats and beaver hats and and that becomes an obsession with him. he starves himself almost to death. He saves every penny he gets. Everything he can do to just put money aside for months and months and months and months, torments himself until he has enough money to go ahead and to have a coat made for himself. Now, it's not a fine coat. It's not the actual beaver. It's watered down secondary. It's really kind of a low class coat, but it's his. And when he finally gets this overcoat, he's so heartbreakingly proud of it, right? Proud that he's now welcome into society, right? See, now they're going to like me because I'm like them. It's so gut-wrenchingly moving. And of course, to the surprise of nobody, almost the first time he wears it out, he's mugged and his coat is taken from him. And he dies brokenhearted. And the ghost, his name is Akakievich. Even his name, even the poor bastard's name, right? Akakievich. It's rumored that after he dies, around the streets of Petersburg, there's a ghostly figure that seems to be pulling overcoats off the bodies of important societal people. Go to we teach it. At Freedom Project Academy, we have our kids read that in the high school English course. It's just the kind of story that really makes people sensitive to the suffering of others. But I'll just read you one excerpt from it here about getting used to suffering for the coat. To tell the truth, it was a little hard for him at first to accustom himself to these deprivations. But he got used to them at length, after a fashion, and all went smoothly. He even got used to being hungry in the evening, but he made up for it by treating himself in spirit, bearing ever in mind the thought of his future coat. From that time forth, his existence seemed to become, in some way, fuller, as if he were married, as if some other man lived in him, as if he were not alone, and some charming friend had consented to go along life's path with him, and the friend was no other than that overcoat, with thick wadding and a strong lining and capable of wearing out. And now we shift to Gogol's text after the coat has been stolen, right? Here's what happened. Quote, "The news of the robbery of the coat touched many. Although there were officials present who never omitted an opportunity, even in the present, to ridicule Akakievich. They decided to take up a collection for him on the spot, but it turned out a mere trifle, for the officials had already spent a great deal of money in subscribing for the director's portrait and for some book at the suggestion of the head of that division, who was a friend of the author, and so the money raised was a trifle. They couldn't even get a GoFundMe page to kick any money in for Akaki, who went home and went to bed and got sick and got a fever and shortly thereafter died. And when they came to clear out his things and clear out his apartment, there was nothing left to take. All of it had been sacrificed for the overcoat. But I guess Akaki had the last laugh, because all through Petersburg there is this gaunt, pale, emaciated figure trying to pull coats off the wealthy of society.
All right, there you go for today. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Parler. And if you have a question for our Friday Q&A, visit freedomproject.com/askduke or send us a message on social media. Now we're going to wrap things up with our fun fact of the day. There are many types of overcoats, which began to become popular in the 17th century. There's the Chesterfield coat, the greatcoat, the top coat, the Ulster coat, the frock overcoat. I think I'll just wrap it up with that, but there's many more.
And let's not forget the coat of many colors that Joseph wore, who also was victimized for his precocity. That's a good word, precocity. And that's going to do it for the show today. For Freedom Project Academy, I'm Dr. Duke. She's Katie. Until next time, stay educated, my friends, and stay warm.